You back to our breaking news story now. Tom Moyane not getting his job back. The North Gauteng High Court upholding the decision by President Cyril Ramaphosa to fire him. Now, Ramaphosa, you'll recall, fired Moyane based on the recommendations of Judge Nugent's interim report. For more on this, we're joined by political analyst Karima Brown. Karima, good morning to you and thanks for joining us. Reaction to Tom Moyane losing yet again. He was at the Constitutional Court at first and the court said, no, we're not hearing any of this. And then he goes to the High Court in Pretoria, again a dismissal. He says he's going to do more. How much money does this guy have?
I think what he tried to do here was, he argued he wanted to be reinstated. I think Mr. Moyane wanted to be suspended with pay so that he could afford the senior counsel that he has. As you know, Mr. Dalimpofu acts for him and Mr. Eric Mabuza is his lawyer. And I think that was the aim. He was trying to get his salary back so that he can fund the rest of his case. But the Constitutional Court was quite correct when they dismissed his urgent application, saying you haven't even gone to the lower courts, so go to the lower court. So that's, of course, what Mr. Moyane did today. So he went to the lower court. But here's the nub of the argument. The very same argument that he used in the court, he used today, except they tried the stunt to say that Mr. Wim Trengove should recuse himself, and they were basically playing for time, and they were overruled on that. So the essential arguments, the legal arguments of Mr. Moyane remains absolutely the same. And the President's arguments in his affidavit remains the same. And essentially what the President said was that, firstly, Mr. Moyane is an executive appointment, which means the President hires and fires. The processes that were engaged in around tax administration needed to be done because this was one of the institutions that were targeted by state capture to be hollowed out. We know, for example, the fact that Bain had met Mr. Moyane a year before he was actually the actual commissioner of SARS, almost grooming him for the position. They were discussing an institution Mr. Moyane had no business discussing. We know that Mr. Dumakand Lovo, a mutual friend of Mr. Moyane, and Mr. Zuma arranged the meeting with Bain at Nkandla. So the takeover of SARS was very well planned. And of course, those were the substantive issues that Mr. Moyane never wanted to answer. Mr. Moyane always argued process as if it supersedes the substance of what he was saying. So even if we took away all the process issues, Mr. Moyane cannot explain to the nation why he met with Bain a year before when he was still at correctional services discussing the overhaul of SARS. They cannot explain the connection with Mr. Dumakand Lovo. And remember, the essence, Kholi, of state capture is that the President at the time outsourced his executive responsibility to a private family for his financial gain, that family's financial gain, the Guptas and their friends and associates. So Mr. Moyane had no real legal case. He was playing for time, and in this instance, he wanted to be reinstated without having to go back to SARS, but he wanted the money because, of course, it's very expensive to hire Mr. Dalimpofu on a daily basis.
The other interesting bit, Karima, coming out of the court is that the judge, according to our reporter, expressly says the President can now go and hire a new SARS commissioner. Is that what the President should do henceforth?
Absolutely. This is one of the most critical institutions in our country. This is the public purse. This is the monies we collect to provide goods and services to our citizens. We know we're sitting with a 50 billion rand deficit here. We know, for example, the fact that Mr. Moyane was holding back VAT repayments, but only paying the Guptas their VAT in an attempt to shore up the numbers. And of course, important units like the business unit and others were dismantled. We've also had an exodus of very, very senior staff. And remember, there's still criminal cases against Mr. Ivan Pillay and Mr. Johan van Lochenberg. So those things must be resolved soonest. But the most important thing is that credibility must be brought back into our tax system. There must be tax morality. And if you want South Africans to pay tax, then those in charge of managing the tax affairs
to enjoy the trust.
Have to enjoy the trust. You can't have a situation like you have with Mr. Makwakwa, who was Mr. Moyane's second in command, who was flagged by the FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center, as having received over 75, suspicious accounts, and Mr. Moyane going to extraordinary lengths, including lying to Parliament, to protect Mr. Makwakwa. So you had a complete breakdown in that system. And so this is a very, very critical structure if we want to be able to provide those goods and services. And I'm talking here basic things that are required. We have introduced no-fee education at tertiary institutions. We have had to introduce an increase in VAT. The poor has had to pay for Mr. Moyane's malfeasance. And, of course, the President has said that the trust between him and Mr. Moyane had been irrevocably, damaged. And the information coming out of the Nugent Commission of Inquiry was so compelling. Mr. Moyane colluded with major international companies, Hogan Lovells, Baines, and also Gartnet, and all in an attempt to, in fact, hollow out the institution and make his friends' tax problems go away. One of which, by the way, is said to be the funder of the EFF, the famous illicit cigarette smuggler, Mr. Mazotti, yes.
Karima, I can't let you go, but we are out of time. Very, very quickly, I've got to get a reaction from you. The Women's League, ANC Women's League, coming out today alongside the Youth League structure in Alexandra, saying that the party has got to suspend Pule Mabe on this issue of an alleged sexual harassment case. How damaging is this for the party, and what do they need to do, because he is the mouthpiece of the party?
Look, the problem at the moment for the African National Congress is this chasm of trust between its base and the party. The party is on a cleanup operation led by people like Cyril Ramaphosa. But we know that he won with a narrow margin. Mr. Pule Mabe was appointed by Mr. Ace Magashule as the spokesperson. Together they are the worst possible communicators for the African National Congress because they actively, in fact, undermine the cleanup operation. Mr. Pule is now involved in allegations of sexual harassment, and of course this is the 16 days of activism of non-violence against women and children. It is the worst public nightmare for the governing party to enter into in this period. We're going into an election. The opposition parties are going to make a meal of it. They need to suspend him immediately. He can no longer be the mouthpiece, particularly not after the summit that the President addressed on gender-based violence and the commitments that he made there. Mr. Pule Mabe cannot be the spokesperson. You cannot have an alleged sexual predator be the mouthpiece of a government that is trying to assure an electorate that it's trying to clean up his act. I think the Women's League had no choice, and neither did the Youth League. Mr. Pule Mabe is a liability for his party. And
the most worrying comment from the Youth League this morning telling us here that actually this is a culture. This has become a culture in the ANC. Senior party leaders recruit young women into the headquarters and they rent them flats and they buy them vehicles. Well, we will have to hear from the party. We had hoped to be joined by Zizi.
No blessers must be allowed in the ANC.
We had hoped for Zizi this morning, but he didn't. He was a no-show and his phone is off. Hopefully, he's listening to us and he will give us some of his time.